there were theistic evolutionists as long as Darwin has been around. Some of his early receptors were Christian theologians who said God used these long evolutionary processes to bring about the diversity that we see in creation. Praise God.
It is great to have you on the show. I am looking forward to this conversation. You're going to Theology Beer Camp, is that correct?
I am 99% verified to go to Theology Beer Camp, so...
I'll take it. I'm excited to meet you in person. This has been a conversation I think that's long overdue. I know Tripp's a big fan of your work, and I've known about you through the grapevine. And now we're finally having the conversation about modernism, postmodernism, all the big fancy things that people like me do not understand, but kind of get thrown into the mix because we're quote unquote deconstructing. So I'm looking forward to have someone of your caliber help a lay audience and also a lay host better understand what the heck we're actually talking about. So before we do that, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself to the audience?
Sure. I'm Myron Penner. I'm a philosopher. My day job consists of me being a professor of philosophy at Trinity Western University, which is a private Christian liberal arts and sciences institution in British Columbia, Canada. And I work in areas that are kind of connecting philosophy and science in different ways. In some ways, looking at scientific methods and what are the reasons that we should have for thinking that science is a correct description of the world. And then I also look at different ways in which science is used to understand religious belief, practices and behaviors. And there's lots of really cool kind of models that help us understand the religious mind. So those are some of the things I'm involved in and working in.
Perfect. And that's why we're having a conversation today. I mean, once again, it seems like all roads lead back to Alisa Childers and Tim Barnett's book, The Deconstruction of Christianity. You have a copy of it. I have a copy of it.
I do have a copy.
I've done so much content on this stinking book. I've had Pete Enns on. I've had some other folks on. I've even most recently, there's a guy named Tim Hull, who I'm friends with. He's more in the apologetics realm, but he's a good faith actor, so we talk a lot behind the scenes. Super kind guy. And also, he's helped me think about things, which I really appreciate. He recently had Tim Barnett on to respond to me and Tom Ord's conversation about the book and some of our quotes. So I just
we can count that as progress, because my understanding is that at least when it comes to Alisa Childers, there's not a lot of willingness to engage in good faith dialogue with people who may think differently about deconstruction.
That is the case, and that's from her own mouth. I'm not putting words in her mouth. She actually has a podcast, Why I Don't Talk to People why I don't platform people, essentially, who I wouldn't see eye to eye with. And she says, it's my show, I do what I want. And hey, more power to you.
Fair enough.
I just think that it's really shoddy when you'll take shots from books and from your ivory tower or behind social media to people directly and won't talk to them. But hey,
I mean, there's different reasons for that people manage their own content, but I think it is a little disingenuous when you've kind of built this empire with the goal of pursuing truth. And then you fail to engage conversations where people might actually have reasons to think that what you're claiming is true might not actually be true, right? And so if you really were invested in this above board pursuit of truth and humility and in community, who are you going to include in that community of conversation? So it's a little bit that's the part that kind of strikes me as a little bit disingenuous.
Listen, I'm not going to say I like being wrong or being challenged to the point where I don't have the words to give a rebuttal. Me and Tim Hull will go back and forth, and there are days where I'm like, this is so frustrating, but you have to do it, and it makes you hopefully a better person. But I will say, Tim Barnett, I am working on trying to get a conversation between me, Tim Hull, Tim Barnett, that's way too many Tims, and Tom Ord. Because
three Tims and a Tom. Oh, man, it just writes itself.
Well, when I saw their conversation to our conversation, I'm like, listen, I'm not gonna go back and forth on YouTube like this. Like, I have your emails, I have your information. Let's get in a room, let's get on a YouTube call, let's have the good faith dialogue, because obviously we all feel like we're misunderstanding each other. So let's have the conversation. But until then, I did want to bring you on because it's interesting. I've been doing this work in some kind of full-time capacity now, probably close to 2.5 years. I'm not an academic. I have some college under my belt. So obviously you're just kind of thrown into a world of like a lot of terms and you're trying to make sense of them. And what are we actually talking about? And the three terms that I'm still trying to really parse out are these: modernism, postmodernism, deconstruction. And I understand deconstruction the most on an exvangelical level, right? We're renegotiating our faith. I talk a lot about this, but there's also this arguably more important philosophical framework popularized by someone named Jacques Derrida. Now, I talked to Bruce Benson. He's a philosopher. I've had him on the podcast before. And I told you before we started recording, I have 2 of Derrida's books, and I'm trying to read them. And I'm like, what am I reading? I mean, such big fancy words. I'm like, I'm so late to the conversation. So I wanted to bring you on because I know that you do a lot of teaching and a lot of study on these topics to hopefully help me and the audience better understand these terms and what the hell we're actually talking about. Is that a fair, thesis for this conversation?
Yeah, that's a great starting point. And just as an aside, love Bruce Benson, very, very good scholar, and he comes at these kinds of issues from someone who's very well versed in postmodern philosophy and sees a lot of information there that's useful for processing faith. And so he would see a postmodern turn in theology as part of the solution, not part of the problem. And so that makes him an interesting kind of conversation partner.
Definitely.
Right.
I did a panel with him at last year's beer camp. It was great. Yeah. And we actually had a heckler. He tried to get Bruce in the corner. I had to shut it down.
The spoon and the fork, right?
Yeah, the spoon. How do you know what a spoon is? But we ended up, I talked to him privately. He was a nice guy. But yeah, I mean, anyway, it was very interesting. If folks can go back and find my interview with Bruce, we talk a lot about deconstruction and different types of philosophy. Again, things that to people like me, and I'm assuming most in the audience, were like, I didn't know there was more than one type of philosophy. I thought it was just philosophy. So why don't we just go ahead.
So here's maybe a good kind of starting point, and it's a way of kind of telling intellectual history that kind of divides faith and reason into 3 kind of distinct movements. And it's not a particularly accurate way of telling the intellectual history, but it makes sense enough that it's a good kind of starting point. So one way of talking about, the relationship between theology and faith and reason is to say, well, look, there was this premodern era. Think, New Testament times through to kind of ancient medieval Christian theologians and philosophers, church fathers, Augustine through to Aquinas. And in that kind of pre-modern era, the best and the brightest minds saw no tension between a life of faith and the life of the mind. Right. The best methods to kind of figure out how the world works fit very well within a theological framing. And in fact, for a lot of these thinkers, their theology informed how they would form models for how the world worked. Right. And there was this unified kind of relationship between faith and reason in this what's called a pre-modern era.
Can you give an example of that? Like, what is a belief in faith that helped shape the world around them? So we just have some kind of context.
Right. So, how do the heavens work? Right. Well, these are created by God. Of course, we would expect them to be understood and intelligible to us because God has just put that into the fabric of creation. And so we can go make observations. We can have models for, orbits of the planets. We can go have views about human nature based both on what we observe, but also what we read in scripture and the theology. And we can kind of put it all together in a coherent package. And there's no real tension between thinking through the life of the mind and the life of Christian faith, right? So
got it. No contradiction. Yeah. It's all assimilated.
You kind of expect it to all fit together because of what you think God is like and how you think the world works, and it all kind of fits together.
Got it.
Now, enter modernity, right?
Oh,
and
boy.
So
it sounds close to Marxism.
Modernity, literally goddamned modernity in the mouths of some people, right? And so what you had then starting, and historical eras, and so it's very rare you can kind of nail a precise date, but certainly antecedents in the 16th century, 17th century, through to the 19th century, right, where you've got the rise of scientific methods. You've got different theories about explaining how the natural world works that don't really appeal to God as a role or having any kind of influence in what we see. You started to have more people turn these kinds of methods to theological claims. And so now this kind of symbiotic, harmonious relationship between faith and reason seemed to come apart, right? And so now you could engage perfectly well in the life of the mind without needing to appeal appeal to theology. And in some cases, you had people arguing that actually, if you wanted to do right by the life of the mind, you needed to set the life to set a theological lens to the side, right? And so this maybe gets full bloom in the 19th century, when you had, and not to make kind of Darwin the devil here,
right?
But what Darwin did in the 19th century is he gave a very well supported, empirical, theoretically informed model for how the living things and all their vast diversity came to have the characteristics that they did.
Can I pause you?
Do it.
I'm going to just say it like Michael Scott. Explain to me like I'm 5. You use some fancy words here. Use empirical and theoretical. What do those words mean?
Yeah, so empirical just means based on observations where we can collect data. You go out, you count the number of finches on this island. You take measurements of temperature at a certain place. You kind of just collect data points and lots of observations. Now what theories do is they tell you how it all fits together and how what the data you've collected, how it explains what we see in a larger kind of sense.
Oh, okay, yeah, because in my head they were at odds. I'm like, wait, if one is based on what we can observe and one's a theory, how do they work together? But that's helpful.
Well, and this is what's sometimes unappreciated about the genius of Darwin is he was able to take existing observations that were collected in certain fields. And he also went out and he was a great kind of, scientist himself. To his dying day was doing work in his own lab, but he was able to go out and collect lots of data as well. And then he was able to unite all these, previously disparate fields of data and to unify them into one big grand story that was based on a very few simple kind of axioms as to how it worked. And it was that was seen to be like people before Darwin were talking about evolution and, they didn't use the words necessarily natural selection, but we're talking about those kind of things. It was in the air, but Darwin was able to, in a powerful way, put it all together.
Is it safe to say then that if the puzzle pieces were all there, Darwin found a few more and then put the picture together?
Yeah.
Like, hey, here's how the
that's
puzzle
a great
can
analogy.
fit.
No,
like, oh, I see it now. Okay.
Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah. And when you think of just just to geek out on biology, as you think about contemporary, biology, it is amazing how many of those pieces that Darwin, added to the puzzle or the way that he put them together still remain in our contemporary picture. Not all of them. We've collected, we've moved on in some ways, but the genius truly was there.
Okay. Got it. All right. So now we're in modernity. Got it. All right.
So you're in kind of the modern era, the Enlightenment, and the Enlightenment basically where, the idea that through reason, we can, cast new light on the world and have our kind of, I don't know, I want to say intellectual wokeness, but that would, cause too many red flags. But basically this idea that through reason and sound kind of rational methods, involving both collecting empirical data, but then putting it together in good theory, we can explain a lot of things that we really don't need to appeal to the Bible or to theology for as far as an explanation. Now, the interesting thing is like some people looked at that move as, again, perfectly consistent with their faith. Like Darwin, there were theistic evolutionists as long as Darwin has been around. Some of his early receptors were Christian theologians who said, "Isn't God amazing? God used these long evolutionary processes to bring about the diversity that we see in creation. Praise God," right? And others, of course, didn't see it that way. So just because there was this turn to an expansion of the toolbox for scientific methods and rational inquiry and developments in theoretical science and biology and chemistry and physics, it wasn't necessarily anti-religious, though a lot of people did take it that way, and hence modernity in some circles was seen as kind of antithetical to reason, right?
Are you talking about kind of like the very classic fundamentalist evolution in schools kind of debacle we had in the early 20th century, things like that?
Well, that's kind of an interesting one, because when you get to 20th century fundamentalist wars about the Bible and the wars against evolution, the interesting thing there is that, the fundamentalists, they didn't want to give up the modern tools. They wanted to use they would adopt some historical critical methods, but not all. They wanted to adopt kind of the best science and the best kind of way of finding out what's true, objectively true in a completely rational way. So they were certainly modernists, but they just wanted to. Then you started to have words like inerrancy. Right. And and that was kind of their hammer to say, well, look, the Bible is inerrant in all that it proclaims. Yeah. And so we just need to interpret it correctly. And then that will get us, a version of Christian truth that satisfies all of what modernity wants.
Yes, this is actually a very important point, because I've often speculated, and it's nice to hear this, that fundamentalism is steeped in modernism. It's using modernist tools to try and almost like compete with like maybe quote unquote secular ideas, and saying no, we can take these tools and put them on the Bible and give us our standard of objective or knowable truth, if I'm using the right language even. But that's how I've always kind of seen the fundamentalist move in the evangelical culture that I grew up in.
Right. And that's where you get, we can prove through these geological samples that the flood occurred, or we can, invest in archaeology to show that Jericho was a real place. And we can use all these great things, because the idea is that we need to show how it's true according to these standards that were laid down in modernity as to what counts as a rational belief. Right. So there's so there's a lot invested in that kind of project.
So what is modernity's relationship to this word truth, around like being able to know truth? I'm learning it's a broader, that's a very broad word, but when it comes to like historical data, things like that, how do modernity and truth coincide? How do they work together or not work at all? Yeah.
So there are lots of different ways and different things people mean, by truth, right? And so here's the philosopher just kind of punting. But I think and it's always kind of dangerous to say, well, this is what everybody thinks about truth, just kind of common people. But let's just kind of go there. So, if someone asks you who won the game yesterday, right, and you say it was Dallas, right, and I don't even know what game we're talking about. Let's just say you say it was Dallas.
Sure.
And someone says, I don't think that's true. I think Dallas lost, right? Well, what do we mean by true in that kind of conversation?
Right.
Well, I'm just like, so what?
Well, it corresponds to whatever happened yesterday, right?
Yeah,
some kind of version of reality, right?
That's right. There's something about the world that is independent of what you believe about it and what I believe about it that makes it, true, whether or not Dallas won the game, right? And I think for a lot of contexts in which people talk about true or not true, that's just kind of what they mean. Whether something kind of matches with the way that the world is, and when it comes to this kind of how the modernists were thinking about truth, it's fair to say that was kind of the standard they were shooting for, whether it's in science or in philosophy or in biblical criticism. The idea was, well, how can we understand what it is we're describing in ways that are likely to be true? That is, likely to be accurate description of how the world is, regardless of what you believe about it or what I believe about it.
Is that like saying how it corresponds to reality? Is that another way of saying it?
Yeah, it's another way of saying. Yeah, and so there's it kind of goes under this catch-all phrase of the correspondence theory of truth, where a statement is going to be true just in case it corresponds to how the world is, right?
Right. Right. I mean, I hear this often with friends of mine who I will argue with in good faith of like, hey, making a statement about hell existing, that's a truth claim. Right. And it's an objective truth claim. It's outside of you. No matter what, hell either does or doesn't exist. Then the next question is the epistemology. How do we know that this thing does or doesn't exist? Right. Am I on the right path here?
No, that's exactly right. And so what you had in
I'm learning.
And you know what, as you probably don't hear that enough, but you are exactly right. So
That's funny. Okay,
whenever I say
that's
that to whenever I say that to Trip, he always threatens to say, I'm just going to clip that little phrase and I'm just going to keep playing it all the time.
The button. So. You're exactly right. Right. Okay. Yeah. This makes sense so far. I'm tracking.
Yeah. So what you had kind of in the modern era is to say, well, if you want to know what is true, right? If you want to know what is true about the world, you need to use methods like these, developing tools of science. You need to build on kind of the body of knowledge that we've been accumulating there, and you need to put it into the right kind of theoretical or philosophical framework. And if you do that correctly, you will be able to, as best as you can, know what is true or get to what is truth.
And we're talking about, I guess the term objective truth, things that are outside of our head, right? Is that correct? Way of saying it?
Where what makes something true is beyond our own, it is not determined by what we believe, right? There's going to be a fact about, whether Dallas won the game regardless of what you or I think about it.
The earth is flat or it's round, right? Like, which is it? Okay. Mm-hmm. That so far, I think I'm grasping a very big picture overview of the modern approach, right? Of it almost sounds like, to a degree, and I'm sure it's more complicated, but I hear a lot of almost mathematical formulas. Like, hey, if you do A, B, C, D, and E and input this equation correctly, you're going to get an outcome that should give you the objective truth of whatever it is you're trying to discover. Is that a fair, broad summarization? Is it not that fair?
I mean, that's one way of describing a hyper extreme version of the modern project, right?
Fair.
And sometimes modernity and the modern project is criticized because it's seen to be naive, right? Where exactly the way you just framed it, as sometimes it's described that the modernists and the Enlightenment scholars, they thought that you could figure out everything about everything if you just had the right methods and collected the right data, and then you could figure it all out. Now,
right. Because, sorry to interrupt you, if you don't mind,
you go.
I'm just processing with you. I think about how I this is kind of the approach I was given about the Bible. I hear it often. You want proper exegesis, the proper hermeneutic. And at first, growing up in that space, it's okay, give me the proper hermeneutic. But as I got older and expanded my worldview, I'm like, wait, which hermeneutic is the right one? Because we're all arguing over that,
Yeah, but that very nicely makes the point we made earlier, which is that a certain type of fundamentalist approach with the Bible is just hyper modern. It's just hyper modernist, which is to say, if you get the right methods and you start with the right data points, with certainty you can come to the exact correct interpretation, full stop, of objective biblical truth, right?
Right. Yeah.
So I just qualified it a little bit earlier to say that when you actually look at historical cases and what a lot of these, paradigm Enlightenment thinkers wrote and said, they weren't, they didn't adopt that idealized version. They were fully aware of human, finite cognitive capacities and, dealt with, in many cases, probabilities, not certainties, as we kind of see already built into, scientific methods. And so there were very few modernists that satisfy that hyper idealized version, but that's kind of sometimes part of the narrative.
Okay, this is helpful because I do hear from the Sean McDowell type of apologists, right? In fact, I've interviewed Sean before, and I said, can you objectively prove the resurrection? He goes, no. But do we have good evidence to maybe believe that it happened, right? So he seems to deal more in the probability than the absolute certainty. And this is honestly a point of contention for me and my friend Tim, who debate this stuff, where he's like, it's not about certainty. And I'm like, listen, I grew up in a space that was all about certainty. It was all about knowing exactly where you could go, where you were going to go when you die. It wasn't about probability. It wasn't about maybe. It was either Jesus, liar, Lord, or lunatic. It's one of the three. I hear what you're saying, where it's actual Enlightenment thinkers were way more maybe nuanced in their approach, and they recognize the shortcomings and how it could become extreme. But that doesn't stop, though, at least in my circles, from growing up in a faith tradition, that kind of gave me this sense of you could absolutely know the truth of God, and here it is. And anything outside of this, you're heretic, false gospel, going to hell. It's cut and dry, right? So I can see how kind of both and can be possible here.
For sure, and different flavors within that evangelical movement would locate the certainty in different ways, right? Some would be through heavy Bible study and just reading, appealing to the right authority figures within the evangelical canon. Some would locate that sense of certainty and how it makes you feel inside. Some would locate it in other kind of ways too. But there's definitely that appeal to certainty, even though it kind of comes through maybe in different ways.
Right. Okay, we're going to come back to this, but unless there's more to explain about modernity, I want to hear the postmodern approach and why it was, what's different about it then, because it sounds like you're saying Enlightenment thinkers knew the shortcomings. So what is postmodernists? What are they doing? Are they doing, there's no such thing as truth. It's all subjective. It's all in our heads. It's all a matter of the lenses that we wear. I mean, what is the take here?
Well, already within kind of the modernist kind of movement, you had the seeds for this kind of self-critique, right? Which is to say, what are the limits of reason, and how are we thinking about these approaches to explaining and understanding the world, right? And so by the time you got to the mid 20th century, particularly coming from some European philosophers, where they just seem to be, on the continent, right, Germany, France, and others, they were kind of early adopters in kind of critiquing a bit of the modernist project to say, can it deliver what it says it can?
And these are continental philosophers, right?
Correct.
Is that the term? Okay.
Yes. Yeah. That's right. Yes. And so by the time you got to folk like Jacques Derrida, for example, Derrida is applying kind of a particular way of reading texts that really questions this notion that the way to interpret a text is to find out what the author means, right?
Yes, I'm going to use a big word. Hauntology. Hauntology.
Yeah.
How
exactly.
am I doing?
Yeah,
all right, I'm reading a little bit.
You pronounced it correctly.
I'm so glad. I mean, from what I gather so far about what I'm reading about Derrida, I'm trying so hard to grasp it. Is that ghosts are real, meaning they live on in the words or even the video of people after they're not there anymore, right? Like it's almost an imprint of what that person could have said. Anyway, it's real fuzzy, but that's the basic idea I have so far.
Right. So part of what postmodern thinkers brought to the conversation about things like reason and truth and rationality is they paid very, and legitimately so, attention to the ways in which interpretation just varies to a variety of different influences. And for someone like Derrida, and certainly people who adopt kind of Derrida's project, the idea of, the purpose of interpretation is to find out what the author meant, and that's what a correct interpretation is. Maybe there is no such thing as one particular meaning of what the author had in a text, and maybe what a more fruitful way of interpreting text is to have a conversation where, you have a text and you have some kind of interpretation of what it meant, but in someone's perspective. But then you look at that interpretation and you point out all the ways in which it goes wrong, right? You kind of you point out the things that are left out, right? When you pay particular attention on particular meanings of words, you're going to leave out other potential meanings. And so maybe you look at this particular interpretation and you deconstruct it. You take it apart. You point out the things that are left out, and then you present your own kind of analysis of the text, not by adding to your own sense of what you think it means, but rather why you think these other meanings may have missed the mark in some ways.
Isn't there also something about like binaries and how binaries actually work together in deconstruction? Like they're not actually meant to be at odds, but there's actually like a symbiosis or symbiotic relationship between the two that we're both need each other. AKA, we wouldn't know what light is without dark. It wouldn't know what dark is without light. Is that also kind of a part of this deconstruction thing as well? I think
that's fair to say, in that, I mean, you can't, unless someone says what the text means, you can't point out what's left out. Right. And so there's this sense of like, there is it is, if parasitic's not the right word, but there's kind of a relationship between someone claiming what the text objectively means and the deconstructor coming in to say, well, let's pull it apart and point out all the ways in which it can be also understood.
This is really helpful. I want to pause just for a second and kind of give the audience maybe like a summarization. It sounds like what I'm hearing a lot of is this modern notion of how we understand truth and correspondence and all that kind of stuff. And then we have this like postmodern concept, which is like, especially in this Derridian understanding of deconstruction, right? Of just how, hey, like text, especially when text written by people who are no longer here, can be quite difficult to find the one singular meaning because we're always going to miss something about what could be included in that text. That's kind of what I'm hearing you say so far. Is that correct? Or
and another thing that the postmoderns added to the conversation about interpreting text is like, oh, by the way, what's as relevant to what the author meant was what kind of status the author had in society. What were their political agendas? How much power did they have? Who was getting fucked over by what they were saying? And how were these texts being used? Right. And so what they brought to the interpretive conversation was paying attention to all these other social factors that arise out of an interpretation of the text that aren't necessarily concerned with finding, well, what was the author's intention? And they brought a lot of those kind of considerations to the interpretive conversation, right?
I can see why Tim Barnett and Elisa would find this problematic, right? Because and I mean that as charitably as I can say, I don't mean it as like a slam dunk to them, but if they do believe, and I think I can find the quote here, I have 1,000 tabs.
You're a good faith actor, man.
But I try. But they definitely talk about scripture being like the objective truth, or I mean, Tim has clarified where he says it is one source of how we know truth. But for a lot of us in the evangelical world, we were taught like the Bible is the bedrock, at least at a minimum,
exactly,
right? And so I can understand how if Tim and Elisa are approaching the Bible as, hey, this is maybe a source, if not the bedrock source, for how we understand the truth of God and who God is. How someone who's coming from the philosophical notion of deconstruction, not the exvangelical, I discovered an online notion, is like, well, how do we actually know what these authors are communicating? Because they're not here. We have none of the original manuscripts. They're baked into a different cultural framework. A lot of the letters are anonymous. And we seem to be arguing over the interpretation since the beginning. So I can see how like these things could be at odds with each other on the surface.
100%. And I think one of the challenges too is that when it comes to things like, a modernist kind of commitment to truth as pursuing some kind of objective, mind independent kind of reality, or alongside of that, kind of a postmodernist kind of critique, and kind of a skepticism about whether we can ever access truth like that. I think it's fair to say that both of those spectrums, they come in degrees, right?
Yes.
Like you have people who are maybe more on kind of the modernist scale, and they might be, level 10 modernists where they think that we can, with good reason, figure it all out with 100% certainty. There's very few people that are like full, all the way to 10 kind of modernists. And similarly too, on the, the postmodernist kind of sensibility, which is to say, well, is the modernist project, even possible? Like, to what degree are we able to actually, be confident that we have objective truth? And some, there are some that are full on, hyper postmodernists, extremely skeptical, very allergic to any kind of conversation about objective truth. But I would say those are kind of few and far in between. And I think there is kind of a sense in which, someone can be committed to the modernist project in as an ideal, but still accept kind of the postmodernist kind of skepticism to say, we always need to kind of interrogate what are other motives that are going on when things are presented, what kind of, what is being left out in the conversation is being presented. And I think those are actually, good kind of rational tools.
Man, you're giving me so many thoughts. I wish that we were in a live studio so we can go for hours. Because this is so stimulating for me because I think about this a lot. Let me throw a few of what I tell people to you and have you give me the critique. Like, hey, here's where I think you're sitting in between the modernist, postmodernist world, and here's where I think this could be good or could be not so good. And you can be blunt. You can tell me, Tim, this is garbage. I'm like, all right, Myron, you're the PhD here. It's garbage. So, like,
no. That's that. We're not playing that game. I feel
well, Myron, you have cool glasses. This is garbage. I don't know.
Right.
But I mean, listen, there's something to be said for people who study this stuff deeply and listening to what they have to say. So, a couple of things. Number one, this notion of objective truth, I think we have to be a little more clear, right? I think on one hand, we definitely can know some objective truth. We can know that the earth is round and not flat. And we have a lot of ways to do that, right? We can fly up to space now. We can do mathematical formulations, etc. Okay. And what I tell people a lot is there's a reason why there's no flat earth study department in any academic institution ever, right? Because this is pretty much settled science. Like we are clear on this. There's a reason why, though, there are hundreds of theology and philosophy departments in academia, right? Because this stuff is not nearly as clear. And I feel like it's one thing to say, does objective truth exist? Well, yes. But in some categories, in particular, when it comes to theological claims, I'm not going to say that objective truth doesn't exist, but how do we know that how we're interpreting the data that we have, which is still in some cases very limited, is that singular objective truth that the author had behind them? And to me, this seems like almost a paradox where I feel like I'm using modernist tools. I'm observing, I'm trying to get data on what we do or don't know to come to the conclusion that maybe we don't know the truth about this particular text after all, even though it might exist at some point.
See, but I think you exactly nailed what is so problematic about the Childers Barnett book, because I would argue, first of all, I really like the way that you framed it, and I would probably put it in very, very similar words in terms of like there is, it's fine to talk about objective truth, about whether there's a God, what God is like, what, facts about Jesus, facts about our own kind of human nature and condition, and, possibilities for the future. I'm very comfortable with the idea that there are, those kinds of claims are possibly true or false. I think they make meaningful claims about how the world is, and they're going to be true depending on how the world is. But I also like what you said too, especially comparing things like, the shape of the earth versus, you didn't mention it, but like the veracity or like the truth of, penal substitutionary atonement or, the exact date of the rapture. Like those you identified kind of those kinds of claims as being the sort of things that we're just not going to get the same kind of consensus that we have about what is true. About what is objectively true. And so you've kind of sorted those kind of claims into a particular kind of category where we just don't have the tools at our disposal to be able to get the same kind of confidence, evidence, certainty that we get in these other areas.
Yes. And for some reason, for some people, that makes them think that like I don't take the Bible seriously or something like that, right?
Well, and where I think Childers and Barnett have mistaken it, like if you coming to the conclusion that a range of theological claims they're just really hard. They're just hard to know exactly, what is true. And it's hard to know exactly how to find that out in ways that maybe science is not. That's not adopting a postmodern skepticism, right? I would say that that's actually kind of more on, adopting some of these more modernist criteria, which is to say, well, look, when it comes to figuring out what's objectively true, we have to use the best tools at our disposal. And we kind of put it all together in a way that coheres with what we know in other areas, and it has to all kind of fit together. And you just have less confidence that these theological claims, meet that standard for what's objectively true, or for knowing what's objectively true.
It. Right.
And so to me, that is, this whole kind of idea that if you deconstruct and move away from, if you experience faith transition, right, away from a very particular fundamentalist type of evangelicalism into a different type of Christian faith, call that deconstruction.
Sure.
I don't think that at all means you've adopted some kind of skepticism about truth as a category. It's not like you're saying, well, look, I just want to make shit up all on my own because I just am pursuing cultural norms. That is completely, that is such an egregious falsehood that it just needs to be called out for what it is.
Well, I agree, because I do rely on data to make certain judgment claims. For example, whenever I talk to people about queer inclusion, I cite the data, the studies that we know that queer folks who attend non-affirming churches, their risk of unaliving themselves goes up, not down. And I use that as data to prove that we're actually committing harm towards queer people. So it's not that I have some allergic reaction or aversion to any kind of truth or data, but when we're talking about ancient history and we're talking about a collection of documents which we have no original manuscripts and have been debated for a long time, and there are, especially in the Protestant tradition, for every verse there's 1,000 interpretations, I think I'm just willing to acknowledge that, man, there's a lot going on here before I plant my flag and say, no, the Bible is clear, and if you don't see it this way, you just have a low view of Scripture. It's like, I just don't think it's that black and white in this category of theology and how we think about God. They're very metaphysical ideas, and I think, to Jacques Derrida's point, we are kind of haunted by the words of Paul, so to speak. We're haunted by the words of Jesus, right? Where we are, we're looking back, we're trying to make sense of it, but we can't say with, I would even argue with even high confidence. Like for example, I would not bet my life savings, on the words of Paul meaning a certain thing. If I can go back in a time machine and verify that, I'd be like, well, it's really, to me, it's a best educated guess. There's data for sure. There's people who study the ancient world that help us make sense of things, but it feels like, again, in the world of academics, for every one scholar with this view, there's 5 more with a different view. And I'm like, well, then who do we believe?
Well, and I think Childers and Barnett are right about this, in that, this type of faith transition, faith evolution that we're calling deconstruction, away from this kind of more fundamentalist picture of the Bible and our ability to know certain theological truth. I think they're right in that it is dangerous. But what it's dangerous for is for evangelical power structures that are predicated on a strong kind of top-down authority, where you've got a certain way of viewing the Bible and how it's interpreted and how it's used to kind of manage people's lives and tell you what you can and can't believe, right? And I think what is so liberating for many who come to, and I have conversations, with lots of people outside of academia who are processing questions about their own faith, people in their 20s through to their 60s and beyond, who just find that the boxes that they were given, they just don't fit anymore. And it's not because they have come to a point where it's like, God damn it, I just want to make up what I believe is true about the world. It's conversely, they're just figuring it out that it doesn't seem true. It doesn't seem objectively true. It doesn't fit with their own experience of the world, what they know from other sources of information. And they're looking for different, more life-giving, more interesting ways of being Christian. And so this is why, what you, like, your work and the labor that you are undertaking and resourcing people who are in precisely that spot is just so important.
Well, I appreciate that, but I totally agree that this is, and all the stories, the audience knows the story, and in many ways the audience is the story, right? So many experiences of the world, our neighbors, how they move through the world, did not match up with the version of the Bible or of God that we were given, and something has, at some point you have to shift something has to change. And if my option was become very homophobic and fight against the rights of my queer neighbors because this Bible is supposedly clear, or maybe dig a little bit deeper and see what's going on beneath the hood of this theology. To me, loving my neighbor is precedent. It's also scriptural, might I add. So I agree with that. Man, it's fascinating, because I think you're right in so many ways, where it's not about not hoping that truth exists. I'll put it, okay, let me ask you this, because I'm dealing with someone who works in this world. Here's one thing I struggle with that I try to make sense of. Let's go back to this objective truth thing, okay? Truth that is out. How do you define it? It's essentially your mind or perception has no bearing on if it's a reality or not. Is that the idea?
So what makes something true is independent of what I believe about it. It's going to be true or false regardless of what a person believes about it.
If I jump off, my second story floor, I'm going to hit the ground no matter what I believe. Objectively true. Got it. Okay. One thing, though, is, again, I struggle with this category of objective truth when it comes to theology in the Bible, because we're still coming from someone else's head. Like, we're still coming from, it's Paul's writings to people, right? It still started in someone's head. It was written down to some people, presumably, and we're trying to make sense of it. So is objective truth even the right category when it comes to theological claims? I'm not talking about necessarily like the death and resurrection of Jesus. That would be a claim that would exist outside of anyone's head, so to speak. But when it comes to like the teachings of Jesus or teachings of Paul, someone at some point wrote these or maybe orally transmitted them, and then they wrote them down, but they're still coming internally from someone else. Is that an objective truth or a subjective truth, or are my categories all messed up?
Well, I mean, I think there are a couple of different ways to kind of go.
Okay.
So one way to go is to say, well, look, there's a way in which you can still apply the category of objective truth even to claims of the biblical authors or claims arise or, interpretations of biblical texts in the communities that produce them, right? And so, it makes sense at one level to ask, was there a church at Corinth? Did it, was it the clusterfuck that it seemed to be, right? What did suppose Paul wrote certain words, what do we think Paul meant by them, right? And so there's going to be, it makes sense to think, well, there's going to be presumably some kind of way of being more or less accurate about that. And then layered on top of that, however you think biblical texts function in God's economy, right? You might ask yourself, well, is it important to God that Paul say these words that mean these things because they reflect something that's true about God, right?
Right.
And I think there's going to be, I'm happy to think that, there's a fact about that, right? And maybe God doesn't care about the exact words that Paul uses, and maybe God does, and there's going to be a fact about that. So I'm happy to talk about objective truth as it applies to theology and biblical texts. However, back to your point earlier, it's extremely hard to figure out what why what evidence we're going to have for those claims one way or the other. So I think maybe another way to kind of layer through this is to say, well, maybe that's not the point when it comes to interpreting biblical texts. Maybe without completely ignoring this category of objective truth, maybe we don't look to the Bible as kind of the magic, the yellow brick road that's going to take us to the promised land, to mix my metaphors. But maybe a different way to think through the reading and interpretation of biblical texts is to have more of a dialogical conversation about what these texts could possibly mean, what they might mean in our own context, how do they function historically in the life of the church, and how can we kind of put those together as resources for a life of faith today. Now, does that mean we've kind of just made truth subjective or not? I don't think so. It just means that, we're dialing down the temperature on needing to have certainty about what God wanted these texts to mean in their context. And once and for all today, we're looking at them for different purposes.
Yeah, so, I find that more compelling for sure.
Yeah. So I think, I feel like however you think Scripture functions is going to determine how what you think the point of interpreting it is.
Yeah, it seems like, I'm thinking about Scott McKnight's book, The Blue Parakeet.
Yeah.
He talks a lot about how every generation of Christians is kind of charged with taking the Bible and the Christian tradition and interpreting it for their day and their way. Is kind of how he phrases it. Yeah, and he also even demonstrates how in the Bible how God seems to work with different people groups in different ways throughout history, even in the narrative of Scripture. Yeah, and condensing thousands of years of history and perspective into just a few sentences.
And I think especially when it comes to looking at Jewish interpreters of Jewish scriptures, that the idea that we're looking for the objective single meaning in the text is not part of their interpretive tradition.
Right. And again, maybe this is not a fair characterization, but if I was going to speak really broadly about these two perspectives, and there's always more than two, but the two that I see. Yeah. There's like this, there's like a static view, and then there's like a non-static view, right? Like there's this idea of like, hey, everything was fixed back then. Here's the cement. It's hardened. Read this thing, and it's here for all time. The end. Yeah. But the more I learn, albeit not much, but the more I learn, the more I'm like, it seems like this stuff not only has developed over hundreds of years, even the canonization of the Bible, right? Hundreds of years after Christ. Like, it was a process. It was not overnight. It took time, and what books are in, what books are out. It seems like, to a degree, that the Christian tradition is still living. It's still in process. It's still in conversation. We're still having these debates and trying to navigate with a lot of factors, right? We're trying to navigate the scriptures that we have now, the best way that we can understand them, which seems to be very, pluralistic depending on who you're talking to, along with how our culture has shaped our notion of ethics and how science has shaped our understanding of the world, combined with the wisdom of what to do, maybe what not to do of the Christian tradition but before us, and they all culminate in this in the future that's in front of us, where we say, how do we learn from the past to make wise decisions for the future? That to me feels like a much more, dare I use the word, truthful way to describe the current Christian tradition, where it's much more in process and still unfolding. Not that it was just beamed down 2,000 years ago in all of its glory. Here's everything. Here's all the right creeds. Here's all the right beliefs. Here's what happened. Here's the right theology. Now just maintain it for all time. It doesn't seem that way to me anymore.
Well, especially, I mean, if you look at the way, and, so I have kind of Anabaptist Mennonite heritage. And so, in that kind of tradition, allegedly at our best, we kind of look to the trying to apply kind of a Christ filtered lens through interpreting biblical texts. But if you think of if the task of theology and a reflective Christian life, the goal is, if the goal is not to find out, how the cement was cast once and for all delivered to the saints, but rather to participate in this more dialogical approach with the tradition, with our own times, with other ways of knowing, with what we see kind of written through the evolving, pages of these biblical texts and these many biblical authors. And if you filter that through, Jesus's exhortation to, essentialize theology to a love of God and a love of neighbor, right? I mean, I think those kinds of hermeneutic those interpretive priorities, I think, take you away from this idea that we need to figure out exactly, that biblical interpretation all hangs together, or basically you're throwing it all aside because if you're just a subjective culture follower.
Well, not to mention, and again, I don't want to speak in a super negative way, but again, my best observation that folks like Elisa and Tim, folks like that, your Al Mollers, they talk about the historic Orthodox belief, historic Christianity. I'm just more convinced that they're not that far back for their view of historic Christianity. It feels very much I think it's even more recent than like your Martin Luther type, because Martin Luther had some views I think people would just find crazy today. It seems more steeped by the American, almost odd evangelical fundamentalist project that has kind of shaped what they think is historic Orthodox belief. I mean, and case in point, like the Trinity, that developed after Paul, that developed after our Gospels were written. That was a developed tradition. First, there was an adoption narrative, and then we have this Trinitarian approach. So even what we might argue are core Christian beliefs for the Christian today were not existent for all time. They were developed over time, right? And so I just think about that too, and I think about how Elisa and Tim use that language, historic Orthodox Christianity. What exactly are we talking about here? We're not talking about Catholics who predate us. We're not talking about the Eastern Orthodox Church who predate us. You're talking about some odd Protestant modern notion of fundamentalism that doesn't really stack up, I think, historically as like this monolithic view.
Well, I mean, I would just nuance that to say that, no, I think they are talking about the tradition. They're just appropriating it and retelling the story through this kind of neo-evangelical reformed colored glasses that they're just putting different glosses on these historic figures without actually paying attention in many cases to what, how views evolved and what people were actually saying in their own context.
I mean, I've heard rumors that even things like penal substitutionary atonement, I think Pete Enns talked about this. It's the most modern, it's the most recent atonement theory. Like there are several others that are way older that have nothing to do with like, God killing his own kid, wrath of God being poured out. But they would talk about it like this is the historic view.
Well, yeah, but I mean, where they get that though is they'll read Augustine or Anselm or Aquinas with a certain set of presuppositions or filters and make them say things that actually really only appeared at a later time. So
Wow.
I mean,
This stuff is
and that's
complicated.
there's a sense in which like that's a very natural thing to do, right?
Totally.
And it's you know there's we interpret things through our own kind of cultural filters, right?
Right.
So there's a sense in which it's kind of natural, but again, if you really are concerned about believing true things, and it turns out that the way that you've been interpreting something is actually leading you away from truth, you would want to invite people into conversation to have that to have that checked.
Yes. What I often say is, I just wish that we had some intellectual humility here, right?
Yeah.
Like I have no problem telling people, yes, I do pick and choose parts of the Bible that I follow. I do.
Yeah.
We all do that. We all see some parts as prescriptive, some parts as descriptive. But in my experience, I'm casting a broad net. Fundamentalists don't do that. They will not acknowledge that, yes, we're also privileging Scripture over others, right? And I tell people often too, if I grew up Calvinist, very American John MacArthur type Calvinist.
Yeah.
You know, my beef with Calvinists isn't that they have a view that I find abhorrent. My beef is that they insist that if I don't have their view, I'm not a real Christian. I'm like, again, just have some humility. There's a bigger world than yours. I'm not saying that your room in the house doesn't belong or exist or isn't even valid. You're a Christian, dude. But for some reason, when I tell you I disagree and here's why, suddenly I'm not a Christian. That's my biggest beef with these folks. Like, just make some room.
Yeah, but it's all wrapped up together, and that's part of the secret sauce, though, right? In that, you know, it helps, you know, identify who's on your team, and nothing does that better than a clear line between who's in and who's out.
Yeah, I guess you're right. That stinks, though. I can't go back. I'm not sure how you grew up, but I can't go back to fundamentalism. It's not for me.
I didn't grow up evangelical. I grew up in kind of a nominal Christian kind of Mennonite community that had certain kind of ethnic components to it. But I kind of count my conversion to around the age of 20, where it was in a fairly standard kind of North American evangelical mindset. And so, I mean, my beliefs have kind of changed somewhat over the years, but I didn't come to it with a lot of that, you know, oh, it's all got to be true in this exact way, and everyone else is kind of going to hell in a handbasket. So
yeah, well, good for you. That must be nice.
But I have other issues, Tim. Let the record show.
Fair enough. The record will show. Myron, this was a really great conversation. I think it's hopefully the first one and several more, because there's so much more to unpack. But I do think you helped give the audience a really helpful big picture overview of what we're actually talking about here, and maybe how it's not as cut and dry as some people make it out to be, right? These things are complicated. They do overlap. It's not like this is the modern era, this is the postmodern era. There's no hard lines here. It just kind of blurs sometimes. And I do think that a lot of folks will probably feel relieved, feeling seen, that, yes, I do want to know what's true. And the reality is I found these truths I was told are true to be uncompelling. And I had to go search of what else is out there. And that's a very valid way to practice faith.
I couldn't agree more. And I think that the more spaces that we have for exactly that kind of conversation, the better off I think we'll be. And if we can do those in ways that, you know, are authentic and allow people to have these kind of honest, good faith kind of discussions, I think we'll all be better off.
100%. Do you have a public presence? Do you tweet like a maniac like I do? Are you on Instagram? Where can folks find you if they want to follow you?
Less public than others. My website, myronapenner.com, kind of has updates on research projects that I'm working on. And as things evolve, just kind of watch that space.
Well, like you said, you're 99% going to be at beer camp. I'm going to be at beer camp. People should buy tickets and go to beer camp. Promo code TNEHobbit. It'd be great. It's in Denver, Colorado. What a great place to be.
So many good things happening in Denver.
Yeah. And beer camp is, have you been to beer camp, right? I'm sure.
Yeah. We did meet last year, but only kind of in passing. So I've been the last 2 times. It is just, there is nothing really like it in the Christian kind of space. And
I agree.
The plenaries, the side stages, just the opportunity to meet cool people.
Yes.
It is really. I was surprised at how much I kept thinking about it after. And this was like after both the last 2 beer camps. Like it was a gift that kept on giving throughout the whole year as I think about conversations or plenary sessions, the music that they've added. It is very, very faith affirming in the best sense of the word.
I couldn't agree with you more. And I'm looking forward to meeting you there, and hopefully folks come out. I mean, last year we had, I think, about 40 people from TNE came. And it was just so much fun meeting people. Being embodied is so much better than digital. I mean, I'm grateful for digital. I make my livelihood off of digital. But man, get me embodied anytime, you know? So all right, well, hopefully I'll see you in October.
You got it, Tim. Appreciate it.
Thanks.